Welcome to the World War I History Podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. We invite you to follow us on Twitter at MacArthur1880 or find the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial on Facebook. This podcast was sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation. Today we're sitting down with Dr. Christopher Capozzola, professor of history at MIT and author of the book Bound by War: How the United States and the Philippines Built America's First Century. Welcome, Dr. Capozzola.
Thank you for having me.
I really like the title Bound by War. It's such an appropriate title when you think about the U.S.-Philippine relationship. But I think a lot of people tend to think of the major connections or conflicts between the two nations as being the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, and of course, World War II. But when I was reading your book, I was really struck by the fact that World War I is really a very important moment in that U.S.-Philippine relationship. But obviously, it's very overshadowed by those other conflicts. And it's kind of on the periphery of the World War I story. So we're going to talk about that history today. But before we get to that, can you give us a brief overview of the U.S.-Philippine relationship from 1898 to say about 1912?
Sure. So by the time the United States enters the First World War, the U.S. has been in the Philippines for a generation. And that was a central political conflict about what kind of country the United States would be, a republic or an empire. And it was also a crucial military conflict, not only in the initial war in 1898 between the United States and Spain, that began in the Caribbean, but of course quickly expanded to encompass Spain's Pacific colony of the Philippines. And that war was quite short, but was followed by a much larger and much longer conflict between the United States and the Philippines itself. Filipinos expected that independence would follow from Spanish withdrawal, and political conflict soon led to military conflict. That was really the most important sort of issue of the day from 1898 to 1902. Those conflicts kind of never came to an immediate resolution, although the war was declared over in 1902. But by the time you get to 1912, 13, 14, violent conflict has largely ended, and the U.S. occupation is now sort of a couple decades old.
In 1913, Woodrow Wilson starts his first term as president of the United States. What are his views on the Philippines, and how would you characterize the Filipino reaction to Wilson?
I think the 1912 presidential election is the sort of moment that it's one of the most important in the 20th century. It's also a great window into the relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines. Right, we have sort of the incumbent president, William Howard Taft, who had been the governor general of the Philippines. We have Theodore Roosevelt running as a progressive, a kind of a full-throated defense of U.S. imperialism in the Philippines, and then we have Woodrow Wilson speaking for progressive opponents of war, but also speaking for Southern Democrats and others who wanted a kind of more restrained U.S. foreign policy. And so, although the Philippines isn't a central issue in the election, Woodrow Wilson's election marks a turning point. This is the first Democrat to take the White House since the Spanish-American War, and opposition to the war in the Philippines and to colonialism had been a part of the Democratic Party platform ever since 1898. So many people thought that this was going to be a turning point, and Filipinos were certainly, sort of watching this very closely.
It seems that there was a lot of interest in Congress at the time to kind of accelerate Philippine independence. Now, I think you've kind of touched on this a little bit, but the cause brings together, for different reasons, Southern Democrats, progressive anti-imperialists, but then World War I breaks out in Europe in 1914. How does that war impact the support for Philippine independence in the United States?
That's a really interesting question. The debate over empire and formal sort of territorial control have been going on for a while. And like I said, there are political principles at issue. There are also material interests. Some members of Congress represent regions of the United States whose agricultural products, for example, would compete with sugar or other crops from these new territories. This was also the time of Jim Crow and segregation, and there were sort of people who were opposed to including into the United States territories whose populations were primarily non-white. Woodrow Wilson is sort of managing all of this, and the Democratic Party doesn't speak with one voice on this, although most of its members would like to move toward decolonization, right, toward giving independence to not only to the Philippines, but also to sort of breaking off connections with other U.S. territories, such as Puerto Rico and other Pacific islands. And at the same time, the global context for this shifts drastically in August of 1914 with the declaration of war. And it's worth sort of thinking about this from what Americans thought war in Europe might mean for them. And I always like to point out that the Panama Canal also opened in August of 1914. And this was a time when many people thought that if war came to the US, it would come in the Caribbean, that Germany might make a move to seize the Panama Canal. And this is in part what sort of is on the minds of the military. It's on the mind of President Wilson. It's part of what prompts the United States to acquire the Virgin Islands from Denmark, which is confirmed in 1916, 1917, but also to move toward independence for other territories, particularly for the Philippines. And the idea here was to confirm a democratic policy aim, but also to prevent any friction that might arise with Japan, and that the United States knew that it didn't have a military force that could be spread very thin. And if there was going to be conflict in the Panama Canal, if there were going to be uprisings in the Mexican Revolution, and also conflict with Japan, that was more than the US could handle.
It's certainly a more complicated situation, I think, than most people realize.
It is, and I more than I realized. And I think as I was learning about this, I realized just what a complicated global situation the First World War was. We tend to think of it really as, what does the U.S. think about France and Britain and Germany, right? And what's its relation with Europe? But they are thinking globally, really from the beginning of the war.
Now, you mentioned Japan earlier, and Japan is always a factor in kind of U.S. strategic thinking about Philippine independence. How does World War I change that, or does it change that at all?
I would say the answer to your question is probably yes and no. On the one hand, the war calms down some conflicts that the United States had with Japan, or near conflicts the United States had with Japan in the previous decade. And some of those relate to naval rivalry, and that led to, for example, Theodore Roosevelt's efforts to send the Great White Fleet on a round-the-world tour, in part to impress, or you might say intimidate, Japan into sort of not challenging the U.S. in the Pacific. There had also been conflicts in West Coast states, where state-level policies against Japanese immigrants had created diplomatic controversies. Regulations about whether Japanese immigrants could own land, whether their students would go to segregated schools for whites or non-whites. And each of these have brought the U.S. to clear conflict with Japan. The war sort of blunts some of those conflicts, also makes Japan an ally of the United States and the other allies. It gives Japan power to expand its navy, which it certainly does. It also is an economic boom for Japan, which grows dramatically. There is a democratic flowering in Japan, something that's known in that country as Taisho democracy in the 1910s and 20s. So a hope that Japan would be a real partner. But some of the seeds of the Second World War's conflict with Japan are also planted then too. Right? Like I said, the Navy is drastically expanded. The transfer of Pacific Islands from the German Empire to Japan one's in the North Pacific that would later be part of the World War II conflict. That happens at the Paris Peace Conference. So on the one hand, it makes U.S.-Japanese relations better and also makes them a little bit worse.
So moving forward, April 1917, the United States enters World War I. Many of the American officers heading over to Europe had previously served in the Philippines. Can you tell us about some of them and how their Philippine service might have influenced them or prepared them for the new conflict?
Yeah, I was amazed. And I think your listeners on a World War I podcast will know all of these familiar names in U.S. military history from the First World War. And I was amazed how many of them had been in the Philippines in the years right before. And of course, that's not surprising, right? The U.S. Army was relatively small before 1917. And most of its commitments were sort of the conquest of the Philippines and then its occupation and its defense. And if you give me almost any name of an important sort of World War I military figure, they were probably in the Philippines. From top to bottom, right? So ordinary soldiers often made that shift. So did people like obviously John J. Pershing, right? Who had spent much of the period right before 1913 in the Philippines, particularly in the southern Philippines, where he sort of managed conflicts with Filipino Muslim populations. Pershing leaves in 1913. Most others stay a little bit longer until the mobilizations for the Mexican War, border defense, and then the war in Europe. At that point, Pershing is put in charge of the AEF, and he really goes and taps some of his most familiar right-hand men to be with him. And that includes people like Henry Allen, who will later sort of manage the occupation of Germany after the war. Who had done policing and constabulary work in the Philippines. That includes Harry Banholtz, who had been head of the Philippine Constabulary, and then James G. Harbord, right, who also plays a role in the colonial administration in the Philippines, runs the services of supply, basically manages the Army's supply chain. And my favorite example is Bishop Charles Henry Brent, who was sort of the basically Episcopal bishop of the colonial Philippines, then becomes the head of the chaplain service in the AEF. So biographically, we can trace all of these people. The influence that their service had on what they did in Europe is a little more evasive. And I actually think for many of them, they thought they were fighting a very different war in Europe than they had been fighting in the Philippines, that they understood the Philippines as what we would now call counterinsurgency. They understood it in a long line of wars with Native Americans and others, and felt that sort of large-scale land war in Europe was something different. So I think very few of them took lessons from the Philippines to Europe. In fact, almost the opposite.
That makes a lot of sense, because even if you look at someone like Douglas MacArthur's autobiography, the way he talks about service early on in the Philippines and the way he talks about his time in Europe in World War I, he's very clear that those were different experiences. So we've talked a little bit about the United States. How do the Filipinos respond to America's declaration of war?
First of all, just to be clear, the war doesn't touch the Philippines in any military sense. There is never conflict in the Philippines. There's never a risk or even a worry that it will be invaded by Germany or others. And so for most Filipinos, the question is in some ways how to participate in it. What is their role? What is their interest? Both in terms of what they owe to the U.S. colonial government, but also what this could do to shape their political ambitions to be an independent country. So as elsewhere, it creates an economic boom. Not only, the price of sugar doubles during the war, and that means a lot of money and a lot of jobs, but also the several other goods, including copra, which is crucial for producing explosives, right? It's a kind of a lubricant that was crucial for Western Front weaponry. And so that economic boom sort of shapes the country a little bit as well. But the biggest opportunity that most Filipinos saw was political. And many of the words that we associate with the First World War, the invasion and occupation of, say, Belgium, a small country that deserves the protection of the global order, right? A call for national determination or national self-determination in the rhetoric of both Woodrow Wilson and ultimately Lenin. All of those languages are ones that Filipinos are reading, that they are hearing, and that they're using to their own end. When Woodrow Wilson talks about a war to make the world safe for democracy, right, that invites claims for more democracy among Filipinos. There's a very small number of Filipinos who oppose the war, who oppose sort of supporting the U.S. war effort. But for most, they see this as a kind of almost a bargain, right? That if we do our part, if we show our support, we'll be able to make claims after the war for more democracy, more autonomy, maybe even independence.
Were Filipinos encouraged to buy war bonds and participate in that way?
Absolutely. And the whole apparatus of mobilizing the home front that we know from the continental United States is also taking place in the Philippines. There are bond drives to sort of raise money, and a very sort of important sort of moment, symbolic moment, when Emilio Aguinaldo, who had been the head of the Revolutionary Army that challenged sort of the United States in 1898, actually comes, sort of to Manila and very publicly buys a Liberty Loan, a sort of bond, to sort of show that Filipinos have an interest in defeating Germany and protecting democracy. And that's part of it. There obviously the Red Cross does its work. There's an attempt to mobilize women and their labor for supplies and services. All of those things are definitely also happening on the Philippine home front as well.
Filipinos are also going to serve in the U.S. military. Can you explain to us how this was possible and how it worked when, at this moment in history, the U.S. military is segregated? How did that work?
It's a complicated story because, on the one hand, Filipinos are already serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. That in the midst of the Philippine-American War, there are experiments with recruiting Filipino soldiers to fight with or for the Americans. That's formalized in 1901 into the Philippine Scouts, which is a sort of formal branch unit of the U.S. Army itself. The Philippine Scouts is serving almost exclusively in the Philippines itself. And so the soldiers who join that are in the Philippines, they are in the Scouts, they generally serve there. And the enlisted ranks are primarily reserved for Filipinos, and the officer corps is overwhelmingly white. That force doesn't leave the Philippines, right? There's brief talk of sort of deploying it elsewhere, as the other colonial troops did. Of course, Britain, France, other empires are using their troops on the Western Front. The United States never really seriously contemplates that. That said, by the time you get to 1917, there are thousands of Filipinos who are already working and living in the continental United States, right? Who have migrated there either to settle or just temporarily to work. And so when the Selective Service Act comes, it applies to them, right? It's sort of, when it's passed in May of 17, it's sort of the registrations begin in June, and any Filipino in the United States between 18 and 45 would ultimately have had to register. About 6,000, as far as we know, served. When they did so, they were not actually segregated in any sort of meaningful way. And I think in that sense, this looks less like the service of African Americans who were sort of rigidly segregated during the First World War, and more like the service of Native Americans who were also not sort of segregated in separate units during the First World War. And there was no sort of no army policy to do so. So I think that's it's a smaller number, obviously, than would serve in the Second World War. But for those who were in West Coast states and Hawaii in particular, there are sort of opportunities for service.
Can you tell us about the army service of any of these Filipinos?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know that much about them. Most of them are sort of serving in really enlisted sort of ranks. A couple of do sort of rise to some, draw some real attention. And one is a guy by the name of Thomas Claudio. And Claudio was, he's got a great sort of story that he was like a lot of people, like a lot of young boys, he was very interested in war and military and, war toys and that sort of thing. And he really wanted to be a soldier, but he wasn't a very good student, and he didn't learn enough English to get into the scouts, which, for most of them needed a few good skills to be able to get into the Philippine Scouts. He ended up migrating to Hawaii, eventually to California, then to Nevada, and joined the service that way. First by being drafted, and then eventually going to Europe. He was the first Filipino to die in the war itself. He died in what was basically the Second Battle of the Marne, and he becomes a sort of national hero. Recognized in the Philippines. There are monuments to him in his hometown in Morong, and he also becomes a symbol that Filipino nationalists who want to show like we did our part for America, it could really turn to. And Thomas Claudio becomes the name of a military recruiting camp in the Philippines. Even the very first American Legion post with a primarily Filipino sort of constituency names its post after Thomas Claudio in the years after the war.
What about service in the Navy?
So the story of the Navy is different, right? And I sort of wanted to kind of take that up separately. That Filipinos again had been serving in small numbers in the U.S. Navy already. Mostly recruited in Asia itself, in the Asiatic Squadron in the years right after, or in something called the Insular Navy, basically that just did sort of coastal service in the Philippines. But the big turning point comes in the era of the Wilson administration. And the key figure here is Navy Secretary Josephus Daniels. Daniels was a break from some of the big Navy politics of the years before 1913. He is not like Woodrow Wilson, or sorry, he's not like Theodore Roosevelt. He's not like, sort of Alfred Thayer Mahan. He's not calling for a bigger Navy. He's actually trying to make it smaller. And he was trying to reform the Navy in many kinds of ways. And he, among other things, he brings to the Navy the racial politics of the Wilson administration and its commitment to Jim Crow. Not officially at first, but eventually begins to try to sort of reduce the enlistment of African Americans in the Navy, and in turn to increase the enlistment of Filipinos to fill lower rank positions as messmen, as stewards, and sort of service positions. And eventually, in August of 1919, this is codified into a policy that essentially blocks the enlistment of African Americans, and Filipinos will be serving in significant numbers in the years between the wars.
Now, towards the end of the war, the formation of the Philippine National Guard is authorized. Tell us about this.
I was surprised to learn that there was such a thing as the Philippine National Guard. It's almost unknown to historians, including even to historians of the National Guard, because the Philippines was not an incorporated territory of the United States, right? The way that, for example, Hawaii and Alaska were at this time. Because it's not an incorporated territory of the United States, it didn't have a National Guard unit, right? A territorial guard akin to the state militias. But that didn't stop the colonial government from trying to build one, right? And in March of 1917, the Philippine legislature, whose members are entirely Filipinos, but who report to the U.S. colonial government, which is sort of appointed by the Americans, they decide that they want to start one. And the idea here is sort of threefold, right? First, it could protect the country if the islands were to face invasion, or especially if the U.S. Army departs en masse, which in fact they did. Second, It would be a way for, again, another way for Filipinos to show what they're doing for the war effort, what they gave so that later they could make claims. But there's also a very practical goal, which is many Filipinos did believe that they would become an independent nation. And they knew that becoming an independent nation in an uncertain world, right, especially one where Japan is growing in power, meant that they would need to defend themselves. So they wanted to be able to launch an independent nation with a strong military force, with trained officers. And the problem with the Philippine Scouts was it had almost no Filipino officers, right? So how do you build a leadership cadre for your soon-to-be independent nation and its army? And the Philippine National Guard was supposed to provide that, right? Here, this would be a chance for people to get training in leadership roles to identify, the core of a future independent army. Now, Woodrow Wilson thought this was a great idea, right? And he loved the symbol of it. He loved the substance of it. And his governor, Francis Burton Harrison, really loved the idea. This was kind of his pet project. And then he even designed the uniforms and named himself a colonel in the Philippine National Guard. This was his pride and joy. And the army itself was less enthusiastic. They knew that this would mean resources, and that sort of leaving men in the Philippines to train this force, a force that was never going to see combat. They knew the Philippines was never going to be invaded, and that they knew that would drain manpower away from Europe, right? And of course, many of the officers themselves, wanted to leave the Philippines and get to Europe, not to stay there to train the Guard. So it sort of stalls out. And it is only authorized to begin its work in November of 1918. So as you can imagine, by that point, the war is already on the verge of conclusion. And they're scheduled to gather in early November of 1918. Their first encampment is actually postponed due to the influenza epidemic, which of course also hits the Philippines just as everywhere else. And so they only gather for the first time on November 18th, 1918. And so if you're listening to this podcast, right, that's after the war is over, or at least after the armistice is signed. But it is technically a time when the army, when the United States is still at war. And so for 2 months, several thousand Filipinos train in something called the Philippine National Guard. And it's a symbol both of their aspirations and also a real sense of disappointment for many who felt that they were going to be more of a partner in this war than they were actually ever allowed to be.
Any other contributions to the war effort?
I like to point out another one, which I think is another really just forgotten story of American history, which is the story of a vessel called the USS Rizal. And at the same time that the Philippine legislature was imagining the creation of a Philippine National Guard, they also wanted to build a ship that they would then donate to the U.S. Navy. And they allocated the funds for it, some from the colonial treasury, some from private fundraising sources. And what they're able to do is sort of not only to kind of build the ship, but also the idea is that it will sail with an all-Filipino crew. And again, you can see the exact same logic at work here, right? Filipinos had been serving in the Navy, but in ratings like steward or messman, where they weren't being trained to have a Navy that would be able to stand up and support an independent Philippines in the future, right? So the hope was this would give them sort of training in all aspects of sea service, and that it would, sort of also be a symbol, right, of what Filipinos had given to the war effort. And again, there are some delays, but the ship launches in January of 1919. It's actually built in California. And launches from Mare Island, right in Vallejo, California. And the first few journeys are really quite successful. It gives people sort of hope and opportunity. But soon the reality sinks in, which is that, of course, sort of men who are trained as stewards and messmen are going to need an awful lot of training to handle a ship. And they didn't get enough training to do so. And very quickly, by May of 1919, the ship had run into real problems with its operation and is taken out temporarily out of service. For Filipinos, again, this is both a symbol of aspiration and a sense of disappointment, right? That this is something they wanted to show off and they didn't get to. Unfortunately, the Navy, at a moment when it is, sort of committed to kind of the Jim Crow segregation system, says, "Oh well, we tried that and it didn't work." Right, and in fact, even a generation later, Frank Knox, who's the Secretary of the Navy, is testifying before Congress. Congress asks him, "Why can't we desegregate the Navy?" And he says, "Oh yeah, we tried that. We had something called the USS Resolve, and it didn't work." And so I think in many ways it taught an unfortunate lesson, and that would take a long time to unlearn for the Navy in the years afterward.
That's very interesting. I'm sure that for many Filipinos, when they heard about Wilson's 14 points, they were probably pretty excited about that. Do the 14 points or the Treaty of Versailles do anything to change the status of the Philippines?
So nothing in the Treaty of Versailles actually changes the status of the Philippines. There were plenty of people who hoped that it would, but quite deliberately, the system of empires is preserved and maintained. This, of course, is the push coming primarily from Britain, also from France, and to some extent to the disappointment of President Woodrow Wilson, who hoped that the League of Nations and new institutions would sort of give more space for national determination than we might otherwise have seen. But even so, Woodrow Wilson never wanted the U.S. colonial empire to be part of the discussion at Paris, and he intervened several times to make sure that it was not raised as a topic of discussion, because he knew that it, in many ways, sort of contradicted the goals that he was trying to set for the international order. I do think that Wilson hoped that a treaty and a league would make it possible to grant independence to the Philippines, that all of those concerns about would this country survive as a sovereign state could be solved by collective security, right? That we wouldn't need to be afraid of Japan or some other power invading the Philippines if a robust league could defend it. And so in 1920, after the 1920 presidential election, while he's a lame duck president, after he's already suffered a stroke that really sort of, prevents him from public participation, one of Woodrow Wilson's last statements before leaving the presidency was his announcement that he supported full independence for the Philippines and believed that its time had come. When President Harding enters in 1921, he very quickly just sort of ignores that, right, and sort of undoes any statements that Wilson had made. In that sense, I think that the language of the 14 points, right, and its language of sovereignty, of collective security, of self-determination are much more important than any institutions that come out of it.
We did a podcast a while back on Siam in World War I, and Siam was one nation that participated in the war that actually seemed to benefit from its participation in the post-war period in terms of national identity and in terms of shoring up its sovereignty. What do you think is the legacy of World War I for the Philippines?
The war in itself doesn't affect the Philippines that much. There's no invasion, there's no conflict. There are some economic dislocations, but nothing too huge. It's really that the war changes the context in which the Philippines exist. Most notably, war smashes the system of empires, right? And of course, we know that the First World War destroys so many empires, right? Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, all of these fall. But also the empire as an international system is called into question. And I think that opens space for Filipinos to imagine a national future, both outside the US empire, but also as a US ally, right? And I think much of what happens in the 1920s and 30s in the road to World War II and the road to eventual independence in 1946 is figuring out how the Philippines can be politically independent from the United States, but also still allied with them for necessary trade and security relationships. That question, was urgent in 1919, and it's just as timely today. Right? Of course, the Philippines has been an independent country for 70 years and a close ally of the United States that whole time. But as the global system shifts, of course, those questions are just as alive today as they were then.
Very complicated and very interesting. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.